This section is toys. This is the sign for ball. Now practice the sign for ball. This is the sign for block. Now practice the sign for block. This is the sign for book. Now practice the sign for book. This is the sign for doll. Now practice the sign for doll. This is the sign for doll house. Now practice the sign for doll house. This is the sign for pencil. Now practice the sign for pencil. This is the sign for present. Now practice the sign for present. This is the sign for story. Now practice the sign for story.
This section is furniture and rooms. This is the sign for basement. Now practice the sign for basement. This is the sign for bathroom. Now practice the sign for bathroom. This is the sign for bed. Now practice the sign for bed. This is the sign for washing machine. Now practice the sign for washing machine. This is the sign for door. Now practice the sign for door. This is the sign for garage. Now practice the sign for garage. This is the sign for kitchen. Now practice the sign for kitchen. This is the sign for living room. Now practice the sign for living room. This is the sign for oven. Now practice the sign for oven. This is the sign for potty. Now practice the sign for potty. This is the sign for rocking chair. Now practice the sign for rocking chair. This is the sign for shower. Now practice the sign for shower. This is the sign for stairs. Now practice the sign for stairs. This is the sign for table. Now practice the sign for table. This is the sign for window. Now practice the sign for window. This is the sign for chair. Now practice the sign for chair.
This section is about outside things. This is the sign for buildings. Now practice the sign for buildings. This is the sign for cloud. Now practice the sign for cloud. This is the sign for flag. Now practice the sign for flag. This is the sign for flower. Now practice the sign for flower. This is the sign for grass. Now practice the sign for grass. This is the sign for moon. Now practice the sign for moon. This is the sign for rain. Now practice the sign for rain. This is the sign for rock. Now practice the sign for rock. This is the sign for sandbox. Now practice the sign for sandbox. This is the sign for slide. Now practice the sign for slide. This is the sign for snow. Now practice the sign for snow. This is the sign for star. Now practice the sign for star. This is the sign for street. Now practice the sign for street. This is the sign for sun. Now practice the sign for sun. This is the sign for swing. Now practice the sign for swing. This is the sign for tree. Now practice the sign for tree. This is the sign for wind. Now practice the sign for wind.
This section is places to go. This is the sign for camping. Now practice the sign for camping. This is the sign for church. Now practice the sign for church. This is the sign for circus. Now practice the sign for circus. This is the sign for country. Now practice the sign for country. This is the sign for downtown. Now practice the sign for downtown. This is the sign for farm. Now practice the sign for farm. This is the sign for home. Now practice the sign for home. This is the sign for house. Now practice the sign for house. This is the sign for movie. Now practice the sign for movie. This is the sign for outside. Now practice the sign for outside. This is the sign for party. Now practice the sign for party. This is the sign for picnic. Now practice the sign for picnic. This is the sign for playground. Now practice the sign for playground. This is the sign for school. Now practice the sign for school. This is the sign for store. Now practice the sign for store. This is the sign for woods. Now practice the sign for woods.